By now you've probably all heard the major talking points about raw milk. It's likely to be the most dangerous food on Earth, it's crawling with pathogenic bacteria, and unsafe to drink even for healthy people. It's caused countless food poisoning outbreaks, sickened tens if not hundreds of thousands of people, and claimed the lives of at least tens of thousands out of those. But what if it wasn't actually raw milk's fault? What if it was our fault? What if it's our fault as humans that raw milk failed? Hear me out. You might think this is crazy, but if you look at the evidence for why we should avoid raw milk, it pretty much all boils down to this one single event that happened primarily in cities in the United States during the mid-1800s. This event was called the swill milk scandal. By swill, they mean used grains from nearby distilleries that were force-fed to the cows. By milk, they mean raw milk, sort of. And by scandal, they mean the dairies that produced this stuff did everything they possibly could to squeeze profit out of a product that, in reality, should have been tossed straight into the garbage, but instead was sold to the public. The swill milk scandal resulted in tens of thousands of lost lives, with one estimate saying that 8,000 infants lost their lives in 1 year alone from swill milk. And this is the primary reason why raw milk failed. TikToks, YouTube videos, and blogs always point to thousands of people losing their lives to raw milk, and this is where it comes from. But how is it our fault that raw milk failed? Stick around because we'll be covering a lot of information that you probably didn't know before, not just about raw milk, but about the food we eat in general. Please keep in mind that I'm just a normal person who's trying to figure out things. If you know something I don't, let me know in the comments. And as always, I encourage you to do your own research in terms of anything that you might want to put into your body or consume. And if you haven't already, please hit the like button so that this video reaches more people.
Do it! Do it!
The answer to this question lies in the age-old problem of adulteration of food. So, what is adulteration of food? F. Leslie Hart's 1952 article, A History of the Adulteration of Food Before 1906, defines it as, quote, the act of debasing a commodity with the object of passing it as, or under the name of, a pure, genuine commodity for illegitimate profit, or the substitution of an inferior article for a superior one, to the detriment of the purchaser. Throughout recorded history, there have been tales, laws, and teachings to keep merchants from adding shit to the food they were trying to sell at the market, whether it's adding metal shavings or rocks to bundles of grain or rice, or mixing toxic ingredients to enhance the color of food. We've pretty much done it all. And this has led to incidents where people have lost their lives both by consuming adulterated foods and by the punishments for those selling the adulterated foods. One of the most famous incidents of food poisoning was the 1900 beer poisoning near Manchester, England. It's estimated that over 6,000 people got sick and over 70 people lost their lives due to consuming beer contaminated with arsenic. The beer in question used brewer's sugar that was made with sulfuric acid that was contaminated with arsenic. Arsenic? You might be wondering how this relates to raw milk and how our obsession with adulterating food for profit led to the idea that raw milk just might be the most dangerous food to ever exist. Around the late 1700s, up until the early 1900s, people got fed up with how governments across the world were handling adulteration of food. For the most part, they were passing laws to maximize public revenue. One of the first of these laws was from England, and it aimed to standardize how much wheat was needed to be in a loaf of bread. Basically, a loaf of bread needed to contain a specific weight of wheat, and if it didn't, the baker or merchant would be punished. Food adulteration was such a huge problem in the late 1700s that some chemists and physicians began to catalog the names and addresses of merchants whose foods were found to contain questionable, if not blatantly harmful, ingredients. For example, in 1850 England, 127 out of 145 samples of coffee contained chicory, wheat, corn, acorns, beans, iron oxide, which is literally rust, roasted wurzelmangel, and or coconut shell. 24 out of 28 samples of cayenne pepper contained red lead, cinnabar, ochre, turmeric, mustard hulls, and rice. Tea at the time often contained leaves from random plants, dyes, and used leaves that were dried and reused. In 1785, a merchant named Richard Twining described that some adulterated tea was made with sun-dried ash leaves that were baked, put on the floor, stepped on, then steeped in copperas with sheep's dung.
That is one big pile of shit.
And 11 out of 26 samples of London milk contained water, fat removed from the milk, and formaldehyde. In fact, a lot of milk at this time, all of which was raw, was often diluted with water. Actually, this article lists a few more instances like cream in London that was made with, quote, the worst milk thickened with the worst flour into a bad likeness of cream, unquote. In 1831, Dr. E.D. Faust described milk in the US as being usually skimmed with starch paste, gelatin, or gum added to restore its body, and colored with a yellow dye to conceal the blue tint caused by skimming. In 1880, investigators in New York found that over 73% of milk was watered down. And in 1882, when food laws were beginning to be passed, investigators in Massachusetts found that milk was not only watered down, but spiked with formaldehyde and boric acid. So I've been researching the topic and history of raw milk for a minute now, and let me tell you, when doing the research for this episode, I was surprised that this article about the history of food adulteration somehow entirely glossed over the most blatant act of hubris and food adulteration before the 1900s.
Shut up and get to the point!
And this is basically the culmination of every instance of adulterating food throughout history. Up until this point, a small number of people might have been ripped off, sick, and on the toilet for a couple days, and a small number passed away from tainted or flat-out poisoned foods. But the process of industrialization allowed for the perfect circumstances to make a large-scale tragedy that would tarnish the reputation of raw milk until this very day. But the lives lost in this dark incident weren't the fault of raw milk. No, there's much more to it than that. We did this. We, in our effort to cut costs and refusal to throw out an unusable product, created a tragedy that most likely took tens of thousands of lives, most of them being infants. Enter the swill milk scandal. During the mid-1800s in the United States, dairy farms were placed next to distilleries in cities. Used grains from the distillation process were force-fed to the cows that were living in new industrial dairy facilities that were overcrowded and filthy. The combination of consuming a malnutritious diet of spent grains with disease-ridden living quarters made cows produce milk that was thin, blue, and really shouldn't have been consumed, period. And instead of tossing the milk and taking the L, these dairies added chalk, plaster, eggs, starch, and molasses to the milk and sold it to the unknowing public as pure country milk, or other names indicating that it was 100% a wholesome, pure product. It was distributed around the United States, and the number of illnesses and lost lives increased more than any other food disaster in history. The New York Times estimated that 8,000 infants lost their lives in 1 year alone from swill milk. Now, these numbers of sick and deceased are referenced a lot in terms of raw milk, but in terms of the history of milk and the history of adulterating food, attributing these casualties to raw milk seems out of context. The raw milk in question that caused so much tragedy was from disease-ridden, malnourished cows. It was adulterated with ingredients that fundamentally changed the nature of the product, and marketing tricked consumers into believing that it was just the normal milk that they'd grown up with. And keep in mind that this was in the days before refrigeration. Milk was delivered by the milkman daily because you needed to have it fresh. There's no doubt in my mind that the adulteration process combined with the milk from diseased cows made for a pathogenic soup that no one should be consuming. And probably the time that it took to process and adulterate the milk made the populations of pathogenic bacteria from the filthy living conditions at the time increase to the point where they were even more harmful if you consumed the milk. Nobody thought that a company would deliberately sell them a product that could cause so much damage. The question I have for you is, was this milk really raw milk? Raw milk failed because some of us tried to squeeze profit out of products that should have never gone to market. As a result, laws were eventually passed requiring pasteurization of milk to minimize the chances of contamination by pathogenic bacteria. But was this due to the inherent nature of milk, or poor sanitary practices, adulteration, and poor handling of the milk at the time? Judging by the fact that Amish and rural communities in the United States still drink raw milk, not to mention countries in Europe and in other parts of the world, to this day, it seems like the outbreaks and casualties associated with quote-unquote raw milk primarily happened in cities where there was a lot more pressure and incentive to make milk cheaper during the 1800s. Maybe the story has a lot more nuance than we're led to believe. Maybe the truth isn't so black and white, but what do you think? Do you think that adulteration of food could be the primary reason why people associate so many disease outbreaks with raw milk? If you learned something new or enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. Leave a comment below to continue the conversation. Thank you all so much for watching. Take care.